Some eyes look gentle, but leave behind more damage than sharp words ever could. Some people sit just inches away, yet their gaze makes you feel like you were never really there. A single glance can hold a family together, or slowly unravel the blessings passed down through generations. Emily Turner, 37, teaches middle school art in a small town tucked beneath the Oregon pines. She lives with her daughter June, in a quiet home where wind moves through the curtains more than conversation does. Her presence is soft, her gaze quieter still. Students say she's hard to read. Parents call her distant. But it wasn't until a colleague whispered, "She has eyes like there's no one behind them," that something inside her shifted. Since then, Emily has started noticing eyes, not just in others, but in mirrors, in old photographs, in the stories her daughter tells about a great-grandmother she's never met. She began to wonder, is a gaze just about mood, or is it a vessel for something older, deeper? Can your eyes carry energy you don't even know you're holding? Thank you for spending this moment with Wisdom of Feng Shui, a space where what you sense matters just as much as what you see. If you've ever met someone whose eyes made you feel calm or cold, for reasons you couldn't explain, share your story below. You may not be the only one. Tonight, we look at 5 kinds of eyes, not to judge them, but to understand what flows through them. Not far from now, Emily will remember something about her own eyes she spent years trying to forget. She didn't realize how rarely she looked at herself until the morning she did. It was early, no makeup, just light from the hallway window and a face she'd stopped really seeing years ago. The eyes staring back didn't look tired. Not exactly, but something about them felt like waiting, like a sentence paused mid-thought. Some eyes have a quiet shape, single-lidded, still, the kind that doesn't widen easily or catch light the way people expect. Emily had always had those eyes, so did her grandmother, the kind people describe as calm, until they decide they mean cold. For years, students assumed she was bored, unimpressed, or somewhere else entirely, but she was never far away. She was just taking it in. That's the thing, isn't it? Some of us don't reflect energy outward. We absorb it. We listen before we respond. We carry the silence in a room and process it long after others have gone home. And maybe our eyes learn to do the same. Maybe they learn to hold more than they show. There's a theory, not scientific, but one that feels true in the bones, that people with this kind of gaze are often containers for what hasn't been spoken across generations. They remember what wasn't said. They carry stories that were never explained. And sometimes, the weight of that gathers behind the eyes in ways even we don't see. Emily couldn't explain why she'd begun feeling heavy lately. Not tired, just distant from herself. Like some part of her had been speaking in a whisper that no one, including her, had been listening to. So she tried something simple. She turned off the lights, lit a small candle on the windowsill, and looked at her reflection again, not to change it, but to meet it. She didn't say much, but in the quiet of that room, she breathed out one thought that didn't feel new, just long overdue. You don't have to hold it all anymore. Somewhere between the flicker of that flame and the echo of that sentence, she noticed a softness returning, not in her eyes, but behind them. It's easy to miss the moment something shifts. It doesn't come with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives in the way someone sees you back. That afternoon, one of her students stayed behind a little longer than usual. No questions, just stood near her desk, then looked at her, really looked, and smiled, a little confused, like he wasn't sure what had changed, but knew something had. Maybe that's what healing begins like, not in transformation, but in recognition. Not every gaze pulls inward. Some open in the opposite direction, gently, brightly, as if they're carrying more than just one lifetime. Some eyes shine because of what they're holding, others because of what they finally let go. People often said June had her great-grandmother's eyes, soft, long-lidded, the kind that made people trust her without knowing why. Even strangers felt drawn to her, as if the shape of her gaze suggested she'd been here before. or maybe hadn't left yet. When Emily heard those comments, she smiled, but something inside her always pulled tight. Because she remembered her own mother's eyes. They were the same shape, warm at first glance, but often full of quiet heartbreak. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What if some eyes look like blessings but carry everything that came before? There's a belief, especially in older traditions, that eyes shaped like June's are signs of ancestral fortune. Good energy, people say, lucky child. But good luck rarely walks alone. Sometimes it arrives holding hands with expectations, with unspoken weight, with the quiet pressure to live up to the gentleness people project onto you. We tend to believe that kind eyes belong to kind lives. But what if that's not always true? Some of the most graceful people we know have been through the hardest things and still choose softness. Not because life was soft with them, but because they refused to become what hurt them. Emily's mother was like that, gentle with others, brutal with herself. Behind her easy smile was a gaze that often looked elsewhere, like she was holding the memories of people she didn't know how to grieve. And maybe that's the complexity here. Maybe these eyes don't just reflect the present. Maybe they echo what's been inherited. We wonder if some lineages pass down kindness as currency, but never teach what to do when it runs out. When June started having dreams about a woman in a white kitchen who smelled like rosemary. Emily didn't say much. She didn't tell her daughter about Evelyn, or the old black and white photo she kept tucked away in a book, or how that woman, too, had eyes that seemed to see past the moment. Some things get passed down in silence. Gaze is one of them. In energy work, there's a thought that the eyes are not just windows to the soul, but mirrors of the line. If that's true, then maybe June wasn't just seeing Evelyn. Maybe she was remembering her. It's a strange kind of ache, to recognize beauty in your child that you couldn't keep alive in yourself. But that morning, as Emily watched June eating cereal at the kitchen counter, feet swinging, hair still tangled from sleep, she didn't feel loss. She felt continuity. That's what healed energy looks like. Not perfect, but moving forward. We don't always choose what we carry, but maybe, if we're lucky, we choose how it's held. And if you've ever been told your gaze is soft, but it didn't match your story, you're not alone in that. Sometimes, soft eyes carry storms no one else can see. If you know what that feels like, leave a single word in the comments. Inherited. We'll understand. June smiled that morning, a quiet one. And Emily, just for a second, saw the same smile in her grandmother's eyes. But softness isn't the only story eyes can tell. Some go deeper, some darker, some look like they've seen too much. And maybe they have. Some people's eyes don't just look tired. They look like they've been somewhere they didn't choose. Not angry, not broken, just pulled back. Like something once bright had slowly stepped away. Emily noticed it for the first time in an old photo of her mother. It wasn't the setting that struck her, just the space around her eyes. There was a depth there, but not the poetic kind. More like the kind carved by years of not being asked how she was. The kind that forms when someone learns to hide their storms by making everything else look okay. Deep-set eyes have always fascinated people. They get called soulful, mysterious, sometimes intense. But behind all that poetry, there's often pressure. We wonder sometimes if people with eyes like these carry stories they never meant to own. Not because they wanted to, but because someone had to. Grief doesn't always show up loud. Sometimes it settles quietly behind the face you show to the world, just far enough back to make people pause and then pretend they didn't notice. There's a kind of knowing that lives in eyes like that, a knowing without words, and that can be a gift or a burden. Emily didn't ask her mother about the past, not because she didn't want to, but because every time she tried, her mother looked at her like she'd already said it, just not out loud. That kind of gaze can make a person feel two things at once, seen and completely unable to reach what they're seeing. It makes you wonder, can the soul retreat? Can it tuck itself behind the eyes like a tenant who's stopped paying rent? Some healers say yes. They call it a spiritual withdrawal, a subtle departure of presence, not from the world, but from the self. And when that happens, you don't lose your light. You just forget where you last placed it. Science sees it differently. It calls it fatigue, neural depletion, cortisol buildup from years of emotional tension. But whatever the language, the feeling is the same. Hollow, dimmed, like standing in a house with all the furniture but none of the warmth. Emily noticed her own eyes beginning to shift that way during the second year after her divorce. She wasn't falling apart. She was functioning. But her gaze, it no longer met the mirror the same way. There were days she looked straight through her own reflection and still didn't find herself. Not lost, just not returned yet. If there's one thing we know, it's that souls don't leave in a storm. They slip out quietly and wait for someone to call them back. That evening, Emily sat on the porch while June played in the yard. The light was soft, the kind that doesn't try to impress you. She closed her eyes for a moment, felt the weight there, not pain, just a kind of emptiness that didn't want to stay. So she did something small. She placed 2 fingers on the center of her forehead, breathed in through her nose, and whispered just once inside herself, "You can come back now." And in that quiet moment, she didn't feel healed. She felt present. And sometimes, that's the part we skip when we rush to feel better. Some eyes are deep because they've been hollowed. Others because they've made room for something to return. But not every gaze folds inward. Some press outward, sharp, focused, intense, not because they're clear, but because they're trying too hard to stay in control. Some gazes don't wait for permission. They arrive before their owner speaks. They fill the space, and they stay. Emily remembered a woman she used to work with, a department head, sharp in every way, smart, efficient, precise. But it was her eyes people talked about when she wasn't around. The kind of eyes that made you feel like you were being sized up before you even introduced yourself. They weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. They scanned. They judged. They locked in. And once they did, you could feel your back straighten, without knowing why. There's a kind of power in a gaze like that. We don't always name it, but we react to it. Some call it confidence, others, control. But either way, you feel it before you think it. Emily used to avoid meetings with that woman, not because she feared conflict, but because afterward, she'd leave the room feeling like parts of her had been filed and shelved, like she'd been reduced into categories she never chose. We think we're unaffected by how people look at us. But the truth is, we carry those glances longer than we realize. There's a theory that intense eyes, sharp, focused, scanning, aren't just about personality. They can come from early survival patterns, from growing up needing to read a room fast, from not feeling safe unless you were in control, from learning, early on, that attention was currency, and focus was how you kept from being overlooked. And if that's true, then these eyes aren't about dominance, they're about defense. The problem is, defensive energy doesn't stay still, it pushes. And sometimes, it pushes people away. Emily had been on the receiving end of that kind of gaze more times than she cared to count. And each time, it left something behind. A quiet caution, a hesitation, a subtle retreat from connection. There's something tragic about a gaze that makes others shrink. Because chances are, the person behind it doesn't want distance. They just don't know another way to stay safe. We wonder if anyone ever told them they didn't have to hold the whole room in their eyes. That presence doesn't always have to feel like pressure. One afternoon, during parent conferences, Emily found herself sitting across from a father who had that same gaze. Clipped tone, fast eyes, every sentence like a test. But halfway through the meeting, he glanced toward his daughter, and something softened. It wasn't much, just a flicker. But enough. And Emily saw it then. What those eyes were protecting was something he hadn't figured out how to express. Maybe that's what we miss sometimes, that even intensity has a heart behind it. And maybe, if the world had given him more moments to relax, his gaze would have followed. Later that evening, as Emily closed her classroom blinds, she thought about how easy it is to confuse strength with strain. How sometimes the hardest eyes to read are the ones that are trying the hardest to hold everything together. But not all unreadable eyes are intense. Some are blurred, faded, like the light inside them stepped away and hasn't come back yet. Some eyes don't look at you, they look near you, or past you, or nowhere at all, not because they're ignoring you, but because they don't know how to stay. Emily had seen that look before, in a mirror, 2 years ago, in the quiet weeks after the divorce, when the house felt more like an echo than a home. She didn't cry much back then, didn't break down, but something in her gaze had stopped arriving. People called her calm, strong, graceful. But grace can also mean disappearing quietly, so no one has to see you fall. There's a kind of eye that stops anchoring. It floats. It blurs. It moves without landing, as if presence itself is too much to carry. We often mistake it for boredom, or laziness, or apathy. But what if it's something else? What if that look, the one with no center, is actually a soul that stepped just slightly to the side? Some call it burnout. Others call it disconnection. But in healing circles, there's a gentler word: departure. Not gone, just paused, just waiting for a signal that it's safe to return. We think people break loudly, but some break by softening into fog. That year, Emily went through the motions. She taught her classes, cooked for June, washed her face at night. But her eyes, they rarely met themselves in the mirror. And when they did, it felt like looking through steam-covered glass. What if that's not failure? What if that's just a body trying to protect something by dimming the brightness a while? There's a kind of mercy in forgetting how to look, because to truly see again, you have to be ready to feel everything that comes with it. One morning, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, not to get ready, just to check if she was still there. And this time, she didn't try to smile, she just looked. Long enough for the image to settle, long enough to say, in her head, not as a mantra, but as a truth, I want to come back now. No light burst, no sudden emotion, but something shifted, barely, but real. And that day, for the first time in months, a student asked her a question, and she didn't freeze. She answered, fully, present. We forget how much of healing is noticing the small returns, not the big transformations, but the seconds where you meet yourself again and you don't look away. If your gaze has ever felt far away from you, if you've ever looked in the mirror and seen someone paused instead of present, we get it. Leave the word fog in the comments. We'll hold space for what hasn't come back yet. But not all distance means disconnection. Sometimes the eyes soften not from leaving, but from watching something deeper arrive. Some eyes stay with you, not because they were beautiful, but because they felt like they knew something you hadn't figured out yet. Emily thought about that the day she finished her last painting. It was just a canvas of eyes, different shapes, different depths, some soft, some searching. One of them, she wasn't sure whose it was, looked like it was still learning how to see. She hung it in her classroom. No label, no signature, just quiet. The students didn't ask, but they noticed. Jared, who once said she looked like she hated the world, walked past the painting, slowed down, and smiled. We don't always realize it when healing happens. It rarely feels like fireworks. Sometimes it sounds more like breath. Sometimes it just looks like an eye finally meeting another without flinching. We think a lot about spaces, rooms, homes, directions, colors. But maybe the real feng shui starts behind the eyes. Because where our gaze goes, so does our energy, so does our presence, so does our ancestry. Thanks for sharing your stillness with Wisdom of Feng Shui. This isn't a place for answers, it's a place for remembering what we already know. If something in this story met you where you are, subscribe and stay with us. There's more to see. In our next video, we'll follow the gaze upward into the brow, the eyebrows, the walls of the soul's house. Your space speaks. Wisdom listens.